Hey Unwrappers, Ollie here. Just a quick word before this episode begins about The Week magazine. It is an open-minded selection of reporting and analysis distilled from more than 200 global news sources each and every week. Readers can discover the biggest stories of the week, but also, just like here on the pod, an eclectic mix of the best art, food, culture and entertainment stories as well. And just for being a listener to this podcast, you can get your first 6 issues of The Week magazine for free, along with a welcome gift of a thermal mug. Whoop! Just visit theweek.co.uk/offer and enter the promo code POD21. That is POD21 at theweek.co.uk/offer. And now, on with the show. It's the week ending Saturday the 20th of March, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen thousands protesting the policing of Sarah Everard's vigil in London, the safety of the AstraZeneca vaccine being questioned around Europe, and jockey Rachel Blackmore making history as the first woman to win the champion hurdle at Cheltenham. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Kari, Wilkin and Joe Evans. And returning to the show, The Economist's science correspondent. He's had a busy year. It's Alok Jar. Joe, you're starting the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Do tensions in Ireland show we haven't really got Brexit done?
It's very damaging for the British government across the world, not just in America, but across Europe as well. I don't think it's a great way to start out their newfound supposed freedom on the world stage. And of course, Boris Johnson will want to move away from the Brexit issue and get on to talking about climate change and other things. This doesn't bode well if they're prepared to do this and treat other people like that. But I'm absolutely confident that the DUP and others will be, again, sold down the river, and they shouldn't depend on Boris Johnson. If they haven't learned that by now, then they're very, very bad at this game.
The SDLP's leader, Colm Eastwood, talking to BBC Newsnight. Joe, a Brexit story. You'd have been laughed off the show in previous years for claiming that anything Brexit could be underreported, but what have we been missing this week?
Yes, you're quite right, actually. That's probably the fallout of coronavirus here, but as has just been mentioned, Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party, and really British politics in general, is quite sort of happy to move on from Brexit at the moment, it seems. It's not really on the agenda anymore. But on Monday, the EU began legal action against the UK over its alleged breach of the Northern Ireland Protocol. So the UK could find itself in the European Court of Justice fairly soon, defending itself on that charge. And this came after a few slightly troubling events in Ireland over the last couple of weeks, which I think have slightly flown under the radar. I think probably, as you mentioned, because of sort of coronavirus and vaccine success in the UK. Earlier this month, the Loyalist Communities Council, which, as the name suggests, is a group that represents some Loyalist paramilitaries in Northern Ireland, wrote to Boris Johnson and said that they were temporarily withdrawing their support for the Good Friday Agreement over the Northern Ireland Protocol.
Okay, so just remind us what the Northern Ireland Protocol actually is. And also, I mean, as you say, okay, the LCC have some paramilitaries amongst them, but just tell us exactly who the Loyalist Communities Council are as well, because some listeners won't be familiar with either.
Yes, so the Northern Ireland Protocol is the bit of the Brexit deal which solved the problem that we were talking about for 4 years, it seemed, of avoiding a land border on the island of Ireland. It essentially did that by moving that border into the middle of the Irish Sea. So what it means is that Northern Ireland is still in the EU single market for goods, but it essentially created a trade border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. Unionists are very opposed to the protocol, basically arguing that it's done damage to the trade that currently flows between the UK and rather Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. The LCC is a group that represents various unionist groups, but most prominently the Ulster Volunteer Force and the Ulster Defence Association, which are two loyalist paramilitary groups who were responsible for the murders of hundreds of people during the Troubles. They have actually murdered some people since the Good Friday Agreement, largely in unionist areas.
Yes, I mean, talking about elements of this story that don't get reported, Kari, the continued killings on the island of Ireland actually never totally stopped after the ceasefire, but perhaps that's something that people in England and Scotland and Wales don't really realise is happening, largely because it doesn't happen here.
Yeah, I mean, since the Good Friday Agreement was signed, there have been more than 70 people killed by the UVF and the UDA, and they've retained their access to weapons. And they've actually, in February, they halted border checks in Northern Ireland by threatening inspectors at Northern Ireland's port. So this is by no means solved. When we talk about the protocol as having solved the solution, it's actually just a very unhappy compromise. It's the same old Irish problem of trying to appease conflicting sides with a deal that pleases no one. And Brexit, again, has just sort of, shone the spotlight again on the fact that this now 100-year-old border between the Republic and the Northern Ireland, which had been all but invisible for decades, that it's now a symbol and a reminder of how the nationalist campaign to free Ireland from the UK is incomplete and the Unionists are unhappy. It's just, this was always going to be a problem, and the fact it's broken down so quickly I don't think will come as a great surprise to anyone who's familiar with the situation.
Okay, so Alok, it may please no one, but it is something that Britain agreed to, in very, very recent history. Why have we unilaterally decided to change our minds?
It's an interesting question, because it's always been a bit of a catch-22, the question of where you put the border between the EU and the United Kingdom once the United Kingdom left the big trading bloc. And it's caused all sorts of problems in the last few years. It's not going to be resolved anytime soon. Even the solution itself, the backstop, all of it was very unsatisfactory. The UK has already decided back last year that it wasn't going to follow various trade rules just unilaterally. And this is kind of one of many skirmishes that you're going to see between the UK and the European Union as the two parties divorce.
Yeah, I mean, to the extent that this has been reported, Joe, the stuff that I've seen has been quite pedestrian stuff, if you don't live there, about, people in Belfast not being able to get their clementines at Marks and Spencer. But where you're seeing this going is a much more dangerous place now.
Well, quite. I mean, that is always the risk, and it's, we should be careful not to overstate that risk, but nonetheless, it is there. And it should be said that the LCC chairman, David Campbell, did say when he suspended their support for the Good Friday Agreement that the unionist opposition were determined that their opposition would be peaceful and democratic. He did slightly more ominously add that the government shouldn't underestimate the strength of feeling about this issue in Northern Ireland. As has been mentioned, the UVF and the UDA have killed since the Good Friday Agreement. They did decommission most of their weapons as part of that agreement, and then sort of their weapons were phased out over a period of time. But they have retained access to those weapons. The Security Service in Ireland think that the two organisations combined have about 12,500 members. And just for some context, Well, yeah, exactly. And just for context, the DUP, which is Northern Ireland's biggest political party, has about 1,000 members. And it isn't sort of just journalists looking for a story here, really, either. Experts on the Loyalist movement are starting to get a little bit edgy about this and have suggested that Brexit and the Northern Ireland Protocol have breathed some new life into their activities in Northern Ireland.
I'm just curious about something, Joe. These paramilitaries, you say, these 12,500 people who are still members, what are they waiting for? Have they been waiting for something to happen, to sort of spring into action? Or as part of the Good Friday Agreement, were they all sort of now retired and doing their old jobs again? I don't know. I'm just curious. When you hear that there are these people sitting there waiting, it makes you think that was the agreement any good at all in the end?
I mean, I suppose there is an argument that the comments by the chairman of the LCC are to an extent evidence that the Good Friday Agreement is still working to a degree. The fact that these unionist movements have said we want our opposition to be peaceful and democratic does sort of suggest that the Good Friday Agreement did work and is working in principle, even if it is being strained. To what they've been doing and what they're waiting for, I guess that is an open question. And I think that's kind of where this is going and where the question is over what happens next.
Well, one of the answers, Kari, is surely the people who were originally in the LCC negotiating the Good Friday Agreement are now old or retired or dead. So actually, if you've got such a large group, it's full of a lot of young people, presumably a lot of young men who would be quite willing to pick up a gun because that's where they've expressed an interest in joining, who probably feel like, well, Dad had a go at this. Now it's my turn.
Yeah, I mean, younger loyalists have come forward and said as much, basically said, sorry, Grandad, you had your go, now give us a try, we'll try and sort it out. And each time you get these clashes over the protocol, for example, which has just pushed these underlying tensions, I would argue, back into the spotlight. It's just going to create, more support for their cause and greater anger with the existing rule. This could cause a political vacuum in the worst case scenario as the DUP loses support to more radical forces. And, the worst case scenario, devolution could collapse. I mean, interestingly, actually, in 2024, the Northern Ireland's devolved regional assembly will be given a vote on whether to keep the Northern Ireland Protocol, because Stormont was given no say when it was implemented. And we've also got elections due in Northern Ireland in 2022, and the Unionist parties are only 6 seats short of a majority. So it's possible they'll gain greater political power in the meantime, or it could spiral into violence, or a bit of both.
I mean, regardless of whether or not they're people you'd want to sit down for a cup of tea with, Joe, do they have a point? The LCC say that red tape and checks on goods moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, quote, undermines the basis on which the combined loyalist military command agreed their 1994 ceasefire. That is true, isn't it?
Well, this is part of the problem, isn't it? And it's exacerbated by the fact that Northern Ireland didn't vote to leave the European Union. The DUP, its largest political party, may well have been, ardent Brexiteers, but as a country, they voted to remain. I think to Kari's point about young men, having heard the stories, I did some reporting from Ireland a couple of years ago, and it's striking the extent to which this stuff does resonate with young people on both sides of the debate, by which I mean both sort of loyalists and Republicans, and also people that are, open to the idea that violence may be necessary again, and also people that are really, really frightened of it. There is a very proud oral tradition in Ireland, and young people have heard these stories. And what is true of both the more radical fringes of the Unionist movement and the radical fringes of the Republican movement, people like the new IRA, which are, it's questionable how large that is, but it does exist. These are often kind of staffed and run by very, very kind of young people, people not far off my age who have spent a lot of time surrounded by the sort of elder statesmen of these movements and learning from them, learned the history of Ireland from them, and also learned the tactics of violence from them. And that's a really, really frightening thought when you think back to the kind of scenes we saw in the 70s and 80s, and then take into account the fact that a lot of these weapons still are knocking around in these groups. That is quite a frightening thought, and I don't think it's something that the government should take lightly, and certainly not something that the UK should take lightly generally, which I think actually, if you look at the way that the UK has spoken about Northern Ireland and the Irish border in the last 4 years and how long it took us to take that issue seriously, it's something we should really, really aim to avoid this time around.
Although, to put the other perspective, Northern Ireland's First Minister Arlene Foster said the legal action from the EU was, quote, further proof that Brussels is closing its eyes to the serious problems the protocol has caused for Northern Ireland. She says, the EU need more negotiation. They shouldn't just be suing us for having a workaround.
Well, I mean, the EU sparked anger in turn. At the moment, unionist parties are urging the UK government to invoke Article 16 of the protocol, which basically allows either side to suspend any part of the agreement that, quote, causes economic, societal or environmental difficulties, to basically phase out these border checks. But, the EU did exactly the same thing at the end of January, when it cited Article 16 to try to introduce export controls on vaccines produced in the EU, including jabs moving between the Republic and Northern Ireland. And they almost immediately U-turned after criticism from the Irish PM and all 5 parties of Northern Ireland's devolved government. But, it's neither side are really playing by the rules here, or not the rules that were agreed.
Alok, what do you think all this means for the UK's relationship more broadly, not just with the EU, but with, I guess the USA is the big one, who put a lot of stock in the Good Friday Agreement?
They do, and Joe Biden has just recently come out with a speech saying so. He says that the Good Friday Agreement is an incredibly important thing. The president is incredibly proud and vocal about his Irish background. This is not somebody who is going to ignore this issue. Ireland has an outsized impact when it comes to policy between the relations between the United States and the UK. And of course, there are other reasons for the two countries to be disagreeing right now. But if the Good Friday Agreement goes into the dustbin of history, or there are issues around Northern Ireland more broadly, I think that the UK is going to find itself in even more of a bind. I don't think it's going to help the situation with the US at all.
Okay. Kari, I'm coming to you next after this. Okay, Kari, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Are we in too deep to prevent a new era of disinformation?
I'm going to show you some magic. It's the real thing. I mean, it's all the real thing.
I Love Magic, a deepfake video from the Deep Tom Cruise TikTok account, I mean, it's a bit odd playing that out on an audio show, Kari, because actually if you listen to the voice there, it sounds like a pretty shaky impersonation of Tom Cruise. But if you look at the visuals...
It's very convincing.
I mean, to all intents and purposes, we've just seen a video of Tom Cruise, haven't we? But we haven't. Explain what's going on.
So millions of people are basically been taking a look at these videos that have appeared on TikTok showing Tom Cruise doing very everyday things like magic tricks, although that was quite creepy, and telling jokes, eating sweets. As you said, the audio may not be completely convincing, but the visuals certainly are. On the other hand, you know, as the account name indicates, Deep Tom Cruise, this is never claimed to be the real thing. These are actually deepfake videos, as in fake videos of real people that are generated through deep learning or machine learning algorithms. But what it has done, these videos, is to highlight just how quickly this tech is progressing since it first emerged on the internet in late 2017. It's just becoming increasingly easy to access and use tools to basically create these videos. And actually what's really key about these ones is that commercial tools designed to recognize deepfakes actually cleared these clips as authentic. And the makers of these videos, they're saying that really they wanted to bring attention to just how good deepfakes can be. And, you know, and the fact that it poses a new security battleground. The makers of this were a visual effects artist and a cruise impersonator. And it took them quite a while. You everyday person on the street couldn't produce these videos. But experts predict that it will be possible to make clips like these within a few years, just using basic Snapchat filters.
Yeah, and Alok, I imagine that some of this has come into your wheelhouse over the past few years. So can you explain to us, if you can, how a deepfake video is generated? What's the science behind the scenes?
So some of the first deepfake videos years ago were created of Barack Obama making a speech that he never actually made. And you might have seen these. Various filmmakers made these. And they came out of collaborations between filmmakers and academic labs. And what they were was essentially, because Barack Obama is somebody who has hundreds and maybe thousands of hours of video footage online, you have enough material there which collects together all his various facial expressions and tics and the way he says different letters and sounds. And you put that all into one end of a machine learning algorithm, and you say to the algorithm, I've got another character over here who's making a speech, who's making these sorts of sounds. I want you to match the Barack Obama video. There's all these different elements of the video. I want to match that to the sounds that are being created. And you train the algorithm to essentially pick bits of video that can match to the sounds that you're hearing. And it's a bit clunky at first, but after a while, you get something that sort of feels real. And the first versions of them took a lot of computing power. They were in a strange part of the uncanny valley, and this is a term used by technologists to describe something which is almost real enough to convince you, but not quite, that it sort of makes you feel creepy, basically. Now, obviously, the technology's got better very, very quickly because machine learning algorithms have got much better. Computing power keeps getting faster and faster. More and more people have access to it. And so you get these situations where, as Kari says, you've had the Tom Cruise video. There's the app, which on your phone, on TikTok, you can take different characters from history and sort of animate them. And these are much less computer intensive because you know, you're not really getting them to repeat different words and characters and things. But the point is that, you know, they're sort of convincing. And this is only in 3 years. Just imagine in 5 or 10 years that these will be everywhere. So it's not a question of when this is going to happen. It's already happening, and it will become too good to sort of to detect sooner rather than later.
Yeah, the feeling of sort of oddness that you get from watching these videos, Joe, it occurs to me only really hits you maybe 5 or 6 or 7 seconds into watching a clip. There's that feeling that something isn't quite right. But in Twitter terms, you know, in viral meme political terms, you only need 3 seconds of a politician saying something they shouldn't have to go viral, don't you? And I wonder if people's analytical skills, even with the technology being quite crude now, are there to be able to differentiate a short clip.
Yeah, you're quite right. And I think the reason that possibly it sometimes hits you as being a little bit odd is because it suddenly strikes you that just what you're watching them do is slightly odd in these kind of cases of the ones we've seen thus far. You know, it is a slightly odd thing to suddenly think, well, why is Tom Cruise recording a video of himself showing off his golf swing in the back garden? And then at that point you think, oh, and it also looks a bit strange. Oh, and okay, this is a deepfake. But you're right. You know, on social media, we know that fake news and these kinds of things do travel, and we know that they impact people. We've, you know, quantified it with lots of studies over the past few years. And so it does slightly feel like we've had the era of Macedonian teenagers pumping out fake news stories from factories, and that, you know, lo and behold, we've decided to create a new way of ensuring our destruction by creating these far more convincing videos. And, one of the things that a lot of experts have mentioned is sort of influencing stock markets and things like that. These things that move incredibly quickly and, traders have to make snap decisions about stock. Should a deepfake video of Jeff Bezos surface, that could hit Amazon's earnings, would stock traders and Wall Street people take the time to check if it was fake, or would they make snap decisions because that's what they do for a living? And so I think this is actually quite concerning, and it makes me a little bit uncomfortable, actually.
And the flip side, I think, is just the way that it basically, these videos just distort our sense of reality. They're basically weapons of mass confusion. They can also be used to discredit genuine evidence. There was the example in Gabon in late 2018 when the Central African country's president, Ali Bongo, hadn't been seen in public for months, and there were all these rumours, because he's quite elderly, that he was ill or dead. And so to allay these concerns, he gave a televised address on New Year's Day, but he did appear a bit stilted. And this triggered all these rumours that the video was a deep fake, and that then paved the way for a military coup, which ultimately proved unsuccessful. But it's just an example of how it's just the fact that it brings into question whether we can trust videos or not, that in itself can be hugely damaging. We can no longer trust what we see.
I guess, Alok, as well, even if you know it isn't real, you can't unsee something that your brain has processed. So psychologically, if someone did a deep fake of, I don't know, Keir Starmer using the N-word, and then Keir Starmer comes out and says, I would never use that word, it's deeply offensive, this is a deep fake, this is outrageous. Nonetheless, your brain has seen it, even if you know it's not real.
Right, and I think that is actually an interesting example in that we haven't had something like this yet, where you've got clear video evidence, which is a deep fake of someone doing something, and then them denying it. So I'm sure that will happen, and we'll have to see how people process that. I think that what Kari said earlier about the confusion is kind of the most important point for me in all of this, which is that this is the Vladimir Putin school of mass confusion. You don't have to always persuade people that what you're saying is right. You just have to make sure that people don't know what's right. And I think that's what been his most successful tactic. Donald Trump tried the same thing with his fake news line and so on. And so this flooding of the field with just absolute nonsense and things that sort of look like nonsense, but you're not sure, it just confuses you. And that's overwhelming, and it's oversensitive. You can't deal with that much information. And I think that's what I worry about the most. If I can put a sort of one positive spin on this, which is that we've had Photoshop and other photo manipulation software for a long time. People know that, and they even use that word Photoshop as a way of saying that it manipulated images. And we've kind of learnt to deal with these things. It hasn't brought the world down, and it's actually very useful in many respects as well as a way of dealing with images. So perhaps there's a few years where things get confusing and things are a bit weird, and we haven't got the tools to deal with it all. But then perhaps also then the next generation, or even our generation later on, we learn how to sort of understand things. And the way you get through confusion, the way you can deal with these sorts of things, is to know that they're there, first of all, know how to spot these things, learn how to spot these things, and just be more aware of what you're consuming. And I think that actually we do ourselves a disservice if we think that this is going to end the world somehow. It would just have to be a bit more well-armed against it.
Yeah, that's what the makers of another viral app that's making a lot of headlines at the moment, actually, Wombo. It basically allows you to turn photos into videos showing the subject lip-syncing to famous songs. So, for example, you've got North Korea's Kim Jong-un singing I Will Survive, and it's all very amusing.
What? That's not real?
I know, I'm sorry to break it to you, Ollie. But, they're saying that what they're aiming to do with these obviously very fake videos is to spur people on to be more observant and more analytical and more critical. The one positive thing that could come of this, as Alok says, is that it could lead to the best informed and most critical generation ever, because they have to engage with politics and public life to understand, to be able to distinguish what's reality and what's not, particularly given that although tools are being developed to detect deepfakes, the deep fakers basically have the advantage. The people who are trying to catch them out are playing catch up, because the deep fake tech creators just basically use the information where they're drawing attention to what isn't convincing about these videos to then fix the flaws.
Okay, so that's the positive side. Joe, it's not that difficult to think of drawbacks here, is it? I mean, you can imagine this being used for cyberbullying, for revenge porn, for harassing people, for kids antagonising each other. on a level that actually hasn't previously been seen. It's going to exacerbate all the concerns we already have about the digital culture we live in.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that I sort of take issue with the deepfakes, is that I can't massively think of any real use for them beyond sort of negative things. Lots of the creators of them thus far seem to say that we're making deepfakes to raise awareness of deepfakes, and you kind of think, okay, well, that's a means to an end, but what is the end? What are they for? Yeah, I'm not hugely convinced that they are that useful, and I think you're right that they will exacerbate what is already quite a sort of poor online culture, especially for young people, to be honest, because I think that the internet is already quite a hostile place and could only get worse with this.
I would just caution one thing about not knowing what they're for. I agree. I'm not sure what the purpose of them is right now, but I think we might end up sounding a bit like people sort of a bit getting angry at clouds or something. What's the point of clouds? What's the point of wind? We don't know what the point of them is. The next 50 years, media and technology is going to change completely again. We know that virtual reality is going to become something that's increasingly important. People having avatars are going to become important. The idea of sort of teleporting yourself digitally across the world to meet people might become very important. And then having a so-called fake avatar of yourself that can mimic you is going to be where this technology probably ends up going. And also, there's another side of this, which is that a lot of these recreation type technologies are useful for people who can't move their own faces or can't hear properly or anything. And it can give them a new lease of life, or it can be useful for all sorts of things like that. I agree that right now I can't see a direct use for it, but this technology, we don't know what the technology of the next 20 years will turn it into.
There was a real world example last year of how it could be used. There was a South Korean TV channel called MBN, which basically last year replaced their usual news anchor with a deepfake version. And they told viewers they were doing this, so everyone knew what was going on. But they have said that they might use the deepfake for some breaking news reports if the anchor isn't around. So you could argue that is one use.
Great.
Oh, it would be very reassuring, wouldn't it, if we could have Fiona Bruce presenting everything?
Robots taking our jobs.
I would just like to stress that I think that illustrates my point about them being unnecessary.
I think it does actually.
Bring somebody else in.
And as you were saying, Alok, finally on this, at the moment, the reason it works with Barack Obama, the reason it works with a Korean news anchor is because there are hundreds of hours of them broadcasting. I know myself, because we tried to do a deepfake video of me on my podcast, The Modern Man, that it was really terrible because there isn't enough video footage of me. The guy who put it together had to go scrambling around YouTube and he found a bit of me on the Alan Titchmarsh show from 10 years ago. And, I'm someone who's been on telly, but there's not enough of me. Most people listening to this who haven't ever been on telly, there isn't that footage around. You need hundreds of hours, don't you, to make it look convincing?
Thousands of hours, yeah, you do, you really do. And a lot of computing power. This is the unsaid thing about all artificial intelligence. And people kind of see it as the solution to everything, but it does take a lot of energy, a lot of computing power, and for deepfakes, a lot of hours of footage. Having said that, again, just another caution that in 10 years the software will get better and you'll be able to do more with much, much less footage. So the curve is probably coming down on that.
On the other hand, you can still create quite sort of realistic footage. There's a case being widely reported in the US at the moment of a cheerleader mum who's facing multiple harassment charges for allegedly creating and using deepfake images and videos of her daughter's basically rivals on the squad to bully them and try and get them kicked out of the squad by showing, videos of them vaping or posing nude or whatever. So she got caught, but it shows the potential that is there and the fact that it is becoming possible for the layman to do this.
Okay, Kari, or the AI deepfake presenting as Kari on this Zoom call. That's enough of that. If you've been scared by this story, you wait till you hear what's coming up next with Alok after this. Okay, Alok, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
How can you look around corners?
LiDAR systems are used in numerous applications to capture the 3D shape and albedo of objects. They work by sending a pulse of light to a target and measuring the time required for that light to return to a sensor. However, this assumes the object can be observed directly, and these systems therefore fail when an occluder is in the way.
A video from Stanford University's Department of Electrical Engineering demonstrating a camera that can see round corners. Alok, that was a while ago, but there's a twist on this story this week. What have you got for us?
Well, so the latest on this is that scientists in China have demonstrated that they can see around a corner from much further away than before. You've been able to do it from about 50 meters so far using current technology. And then this new research has shown that they can do it from 1.5 kilometers away, which is kind of crazy.
It is. I mean, a lot of people listening would have been, hold on a second. That's what they would have been thinking when you just said you were able to see round a corner already, thinking, no, you can't. You can't see round a corner. That's not possible. So can you tell us what is already possible? Because I didn't know you could see round a corner.
It's absolutely true. You can't see around a corner in any normal situation. The way you can see anything, of course, is that light bounces off that thing and into your eyes. And so for light to enter your eyes from that thing, you need a direct line of sight. If something's in the way, if it's, let's say, an object around the corner, the light can't get into your eyes. Now, think of it this way. Imagine that you're standing on one side of a corner and there's a person on the other side, around the corner. If you put a mirror at the corner, you'll be able to see them because light then bounces off that person into that mirror and onto your face. So that makes a lot of sense. But of course, in most situations, you're not just going to be able to stick a mirror somewhere. So what the research in the last decade, this has been going on for some time now, has been able to do is to use almost any object, any wall, however dark it is, as a mirror. Now, you might not see it with your eyes, but every object reflects light, even if it's just a few photons. And if you can detect that light, then you can sort of work backwards and look at and try and reconstruct the object it bounced off. It's very, very hard to do this, and it requires a lot of computing power. It requires very sophisticated light detectors. But in the last decade, what we've seen is that exactly those things, computing power and light detectors have got so much better that you can start to reconstruct things by looking at how photons are sort of bouncing around. The research that has been done in China is something. It works a bit like this. What you have to do is you're standing on one side of the corner and you have a laser next to you, essentially. And that laser illuminates a wall. Imagine this is where you would have the mirror in our earlier example. It illuminates that wall multiple times a second, like millions of times a second. And that light sort of bounces off in all directions. Some of that light bounces off and hits the object that's around the corner. And then when the photon hits that object, it bounces back onto the wall and then onto your eyes. Now that's a lot of bouncing around, and every flash of the laser light, maybe 2 or 3 photons will end up back in your eyes, which you cannot detect. You definitely can't detect that.
But a machine can?
But machines now can. So there are machines which are these sort of technological successors of CCDs. So these things which we now know of, which we use all over the place, have in our cameras, our phones, which are essentially ways of turning light into digital information. They can detect individual photons. Sorry, someone just came into my room. I'm sorry.
There you are. If you could have seen around the corner, you'd know.
These things can detect individual photons now. I won't go into how they do it, but what they can do is they can detect these individual photons, and then if you sort of take your laser and sort of shine it up and down along that wall, so that then there's lots of light sort of flowing onto the object you're trying to see, then you'll get a decent number of photons arriving back at your detector, and using very, 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 very sophisticated, again, artificial intelligence algorithms that can sort of reconstruct all the paths of the light. You can get an indication of what's around the corner. And doing it from 1.5 kilometers away is the advance this week, which is quite incredible if you think about it. It's like that is a long way to be able to detect individual photons.
I mean, you say incredible. I think terrifying. I mean, Kari, this is basically sort of X-ray specs, isn't it? And you can kind of imagine this very easily in a military setting.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the obvious applications, real-world applications of this sort of, virtual camera or whatever you want to call it. But I think there are so many positive outcomes of this. In hostage situations, it could be hugely useful. Search and rescue, it could help rescue teams find people blocked, from view by rubble. There's space exploration is a whole different area that it creates so many possibilities. You've got road safety, because you could enable self-driving cars to react to obstacles and dangers before human passengers can see them. Medical imaging, it could make that far less invasive. I think to me this is actually a really positive development.
Okay, Joe, but when I shut my blinds, I don't want someone to be able to see me. It's as simple as that.
No, I can see what you mean, and I can see how your mind might leap to totalitarian government snooping around the wall of a person's home from a kilometre away is quite a frightening thought. But I think Kari's right, and I think as Alok kind of explained there, it's got lots of very positive applications. And as Kari also mentioned, NASA has paid for this type of research in the past because they'd like to put them on satellites with the potential to photograph or map this kind of invisible parts of moons and planets. And so I think this is actually really quite interesting and exciting. I couldn't have explained it nearly as well as Alok, but it's one of these stories that I think, despite my slight failure to understand it perfectly, is really quite exciting.
Alok, it seems to me we're quite a long way away from a computer being sophisticated enough that you would allow it to drive a car based on what it thinks it sees coming around the corner. I mean, as a human being who can actually see what is round in front of you, it would be very disconcerting if your car slammed on the brakes and it had got it wrong, wouldn't it?
Well, the autonomous vehicle application seems to be the one that all of these researchers want to use it on first. So you're right, Ollie. This wouldn't be something that the car would use independently. It would use it in amongst a suite of things to sort of decide how it's going to drive down the road. For an autonomous car, you wouldn't need to know what the object is around the corner. You wouldn't need to have a perfect high fidelity image. All you need to know is that there is some sort of object very closely moving towards the corner that you can't see, which means that you can then slow down, which is a useful piece of information. It's the equivalent of those mirrors on the side of a road, on hairpin junctions, right? Now, to your point about not wanting snooping, I think that this is a really good point. In the system we've talked about, what you could do is you could just shut the door. There's no path for the light to follow. Light can't go through opaque objects. On the other hand, things like infrared light or even sound, you can hear that through doors, windows. People have been using, spy agencies use these all the time to work out what's on the other side of a door. So this is just this adds a bit more context to all of that. And the where this research kind of can go, if you wanted it to, it was that, imagine you have a situation where you've got an object between you and the thing you're trying to detect. Let's say it's search and rescue. You could use a combination of this technique, audio, radar type technology, heat imaging, to just get around this object, to sort of be able to see what's on the other side of it. And that would work not only for like a boulder in a way between you and something you're trying to rescue. It could work for a medical imaging where you're trying to see behind a cell, for example, without damaging the cell in some way, if there's a tumor there or something. X-rays, as we know, which are used in radiotherapy, can damage all sorts of cells whilst they're trying to kill the cancer cells. So if you can work out a way of targeting them more effectively, that would be interesting. I don't think it's as scary as you might think.
But the main use is going to be armies blowing people up, isn't it? I mean, we can say, there's lots of great uses for it, but I mean, really, it's going to be another weapon. That's what you'd use it for. The guy doesn't know you're watching, and now you can shoot him from 1.5 kilometres away.
What you're talking about is basically SEAL Team 6 pointing their guns at a wall, and then whoever the heirs of Osama bin Laden are in 10 years being able to shoot them. Yeah, totally right. But they can do that in lots of other ways too, to be honest. You can look into buildings and the high resolution satellites and all those heat maps and all sorts of other things. So this is just another piece of that.
Well, I'm glad you all think it's fine. I'm terrified. Kari, have I convinced you in any way?
No, I still think, like Alok says, this is, a drop. It's an important drop, but it's a drop in the ocean of a trend that's happening anyway. And I think that I do think the positives outweigh the negatives, personally.
Well, it all at least seems very clear with laser focus. So thank you to all of you for that. And that is it for this week. Thank you to Kari, Alok and Joe for their stories. Remember, you can subscribe to this show for free. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. And remember to claim your first 6 issues of The Week magazine now for free. If you haven't done that already, you get a welcome gift as well by visiting theweek.co.uk/offer and entering the promo code POD21. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.